I'm pleased to welcome Robert Mace to the Water Resources podcast. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Robert is the Executive Director at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment and is also a Professor of Practice in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Texas State University. Robert has had this position since 2017. And prior to that, Robert worked at the Texas Water Development Board for 18 years as a Deputy Executive Administrator for Water Science and Conservation. So your background is extremely interesting, Robert, because it bridges the gap between the science and the technical aspects and policy, and really admire what you've been able to do to link those fields.
Well, thank you. And you did mention that, we were colleagues, I guess, at the Bureau I was there for about 8.5 years, which is where I got bitten by the science and policy bug. I worked on a study that was looking at natural attenuation of contaminants from gasoline spills underneath gasoline stations, with natural attenuation being, naturally occurring bacteria that were breaking down those constituents. And so it was very satisfying to do that study. And it was literally placed on every desk over at the state capitol, and then led to some substantial changes in how the state was addressing those contamination issues. And so I was bit by the bug there. Haven't looked back since.
Well, we've known each other since the late 90s when you first came to Austin from New Mexico, and
the early 90s, Bridget.
Was it? Okay.
Yes, 91.
That's too funny. So Robert recently published a book called Groundwater Sustainability, Conception, Development, and Application. And so it's available on Amazon. It came out in January in 2023. And I know what you were doing during COVID, Robert. And I would encourage listeners to read it because it is a tremendous wealth of information. And I love the historical context you provide for many of the concepts related to sustainability and all of the different examples that you show in the book. And it's difficult sometimes for people outside of groundwater resources to understand these fundamentals. And this is presented in a very, way that people can pick it up, I think, readily with the illustrations and other descriptions.
Yeah, and I'm glad you picked that up. I mean, one thing I gained from kind of being a scientist working in the interface of policy and science is that communication's really important. A lot of scientists and engineers will complain that the policymakers don't consider their work, but if you're not speaking in a language that they can understand, for example, I do not use acronyms. I'm very anti-acronym. And using analogies, they're not going to get it, and if they don't understand it, it's not going to work into policy. And so that has turned into my writing style, and I was very fortunate that the editors at Palgrave Macmillan allowed me to write the book I wanted to write, it is an academic book, but it is written for practitioners, policymakers. I just would rather explain things clearly than try to impress people with my big words.
That's interesting that you bring that up, Robert. I mean, I'm serving on a NASA committee these days, and every other word is an acronym, and I have a list, and I have to translate.
The feds are the worst. I mean, we were all bad, but I've been in meetings, sat there for 2 hours, had no idea what anybody was saying. And I get it. It makes things easier for us to communicate within our own little scientific subcultures, but it does create a major barrier to understanding, even in a multidisciplinary world, let alone the public and policymakers. So one of these days, I'm going to write a book that pretty much declares war on acronyms, and probably when I retire.
I think some people use it as a test to see if you belong,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so to write this book, you had to submit it to for review, the concepts of the book early on. So maybe you were telling me some funny stories about that.
Yeah. The Gary Schindel, who's recently retired from the Edwards Aquifer Authority, had a professor friend that reached out to him about writing a book on groundwater sustainability, and Gary was like, no, not interested. But he said, hey, I recommend Robert Mace. And so I got that call, and it has been a life goal of mine to write a book. And so, but at the same time, it's like the last thing I needed to do is write a book with everything else going on in my life. But I was like, yeah, why the hell not? And so similar, well, maybe not similar. It's like given it's an academic book, it has to go through peer review, which is similar to getting a peer-reviewed paper published. But I also had to have the proposal for the book undergo peer review. And so there were 5 peer reviews of the book outline. And, there's, in the scientific world, we make jokes about reviewer number 2, who's a real pain in the butt reviewer. And so sure enough, reviewer 2 is it was a pretty intense review. In fact, my editors were like, don't worry about reviewer number 2, you don't have to respond. And I read it, and it was a real angry review. But there was, there was also some gems in there, gems of wisdom that I could take. But the funniest thing was the reviewer made a comment that I'm not sure the reviewer intended me to see this comment. It might have been just for the editor, but it was like, this book is too important to entrust to a Texan. And I responded to that comment. I responded to all this person's comments, but responded to that comment because when people think of Texas and groundwater management, they think of mismanagement, and they think specifically about the Ogallala aquifer in the southern high plains, which is really world famous for not producing an aquifer sustainably. And when I wrote this book, I could see that was an example that popped up time and time again, across the world of literature. A lot of people don't realize that there are a lot of interesting things that occur in Texas, and we do manage some of our aquifers sustainably. And so I think Texas has a lot to offer. So in this book, it's intended for an international audience. I do have international short case studies in one of the chapters, but invariably I bring my Texas experience to this book and share Texas stories, which I think are useful for various places around the world, because I think the problems we face in Texas are faced across the planet.
Right. And I mean, I know from my own work, Texas, we go from semi-arid to humid, from west to east. We're subjected to a range of climate conditions, floods and droughts, and a variety of different types of aquifers. And I know when I was doing work early on, a lot of the conditions and situations were similar to those in Australia. So there was a lot of analogs over there. So today I hope that we can discuss various concepts of sustainability from the book, and I really admire how you bring us through the history of these concepts and how they evolved over time, and then the challenges for managing groundwater resources in Texas and elsewhere, and then end up with potential solutions at different scales, from the city scale like Austin, where we live, or more regional approaches. So let's maybe start off, when you talk about sustainability in the book initially, you say some of the ideas of managing sustainably come from surface water and the concepts of safe yield and things like that. And you are in San Marcos and San Marcos Springs, the Edwards Aquifer, which is sort of like a subsurface analog to surface water. And so it's kind of a hybrid between surface water issues and groundwater issues. It's so dynamic, it responds so quickly. And so maybe you can describe what you think the current conditions are like in the Edwards Aquifer, and where Texas is at the moment in terms of droughts, conditions and stuff like that.
Sure. So we've, just come out of 3 years in a row of La Nina conditions, which tends to mean, and certainly has meant for the last 3 years, warmer than normal, cooler than normal conditions and drier than normal conditions. And actually, I got that reversed. Warmer than normal conditions and drier than normal conditions. And we've certainly seen that across the state with the drought. It's, if you look at the drought monitor, it's not been as bad as it was in 2011 to 2015. But each drought is different, and each drought has a different kind of focus of where it really pounds the state. And in the hill country and the kind of the catchment zone for the Edwards Aquifer and the recharge zone for the Edwards Aquifer has been particularly hit hard in this drought. And so we've seen spring levels decline precipitously. J17, the indicator well, go down also precipitously. For on and off, depending on the day. For the last 6 months, we've been seeing the lowest flows in San Marcos Springs that we've seen since the end of the drought of the 1950s, since 1957. So like right now, the flow is under 80 cubic feet per second. Normally, we would be about twice that for this time of year. And the only time it's been lower goes back to 57. And that's been pretty consistent. There's things go up and down a little bit if we get some rains that come through, and that drought is continuing. At this point, I would call it probably a hydrologic drought rather than a precipitation drought. If you look at the long-term rainfall amounts, we're still not normal, but we're not too far from normal. But what's happening is we'll get a pretty decent rain. Soil will suck it all up. It evapotranspirates back out, and then we'll have a big dry spell, and then we'll get another rain. So we've been getting the rains, but we've not been getting kind of repeated rains that causes a great deal of recharge and causes a great deal of runoff. So hydrologically, from the aquifer's perspective, we're still pretty low flow.
I mean, oftentimes people say, we're getting this rain, why are the reservoirs not filling up, or why are we not seeing it? And oftentimes, those rains, you almost need a flood to end a drought. And that's what we've seen in California this year. They had atmospheric rivers in December and January, and that ended the 3-year drought that they were subjected to prior to that. And 2017 was the same. So you almost need a big flood to end these long-term droughts. Right.
And you need some rains to prime the pump, basically kind of fill up that soil moisture and then have a big rain on top of that. If it was that last major statewide drought, 2011, 2015, ended with some pretty huge floods here locally. And what's interesting about that was we'd had a bigger rainfall than the one that caused the Blanco River to flow over Interstate 35 a week before, but there was little to no runoff. But then another still sizable storm hit and then caused that flooding. So yeah,
was that the Wimberley flood?
It was, yeah. There was a bigger rainfall event before that, but it just all got sucked up by the soil. And then when that second storm hit, soil was satiated and just all ran off.
So a colleague of mine was doing a study on atmospheric rivers in Texas for the Texas Water Development Board, and that was an atmospheric river that came from the Atlantic, that Wimberley flood. So understanding these extremes is very important. So maybe we go back to the sustainability book, Robert, and some of the concepts then related to managing groundwater sustainably. The safe yield concept has been around for a long time. Maybe you can explain that a little bit. And, John Bredehoft's water budget myth, those concepts.
Yeah, so the concepts of how to manage groundwater, they sourced from surface water management, and many, if not most, of the early hydrogeologists were engineers. And presumably they were trained in, how to tame rivers and create storage from rivers behind reservoirs. And And if you look at how they're managed, they're managed through a safe yield or a firm yield type approach. One thing I hadn't appreciated till I wrote this book was that everybody uses those terms differently. So for folks that are outside of Texas or other parts of the world, just know that the definition of those terms is really important. But the concept for surface water is like you build a reservoir, and the goal isn't to suck the reservoir out dry as soon as possible. You want to manage it over the long term. And so engineers will then typically make calculations based on the flow coming in over what's a reliable supply that you can get from that reservoir system year after year without running out of water. That's typically looking backwards. Some of these issues pop up in the other Colorado River Basin on did they have enough record? You can always have a drought worse than the drought of record. But that's how that's determined. In Texas, we call that firm yield. Other places call that a safe yield. In Texas, safe yield means something different. It's what you can rely on year after year with a built-in safety factor. Anyways, when USGS scientists were doing work in California and thinking about how to manage groundwater in one of their basins, they ported that safe yield concept from surface water over into groundwater. And then interestingly enough, also kind of brought in the mushiness of those definitions. Basically it's like how much you can produce indefinitely without causing dangerous depletions. And dangerous, air quotes, is subjective. What I think is dangerous, you may not think is dangerous, or a legislature might not think is dangerous, or the local stakeholders may not think is dangerous. So it's interesting that the elements of our current definitions of safe yield or sustainable yield still build that into the concept. That's also, in the book, I read the literature forward in time. So like the first mention of the safe yield concept is 1915. And then I just, found papers and reports so I could relive the experience of the development of it. And that was interesting too, because, people started thinking about different things that were important. Back in those days, in the very earliest days of safe yield, it was about maximizing production for the benefit of people. And the dangerous depletion related more to maybe creating saltwater intrusion that would wreck the supply. But then with time, as society changed, the definition of safe yield changed, or what was considered dangerous changed to include, impacts to other basins, impacts to other uses. In the 70s, environment became important, and so then the environment got brought in. As scientists and engineers, we like things to be reproducible. It's like you can't, it's not good if you have a scientific process that if I do it, I come with one answer, and if you do it, Dr. Scanlon, you come up with a different one. But inherently, safe yield, or really any question of managing groundwater, is a policy question. And to me, it's policy informed by the science. And policy is messy. It depends on the people around the table, the time that happened, the information known at that time. Those decisions can change with time. And so, sustainable yield or safe yield can change as people's policy preferences change. And there's a lot of angst in scientific literature, hydrogeologic literature about that. Which is unfortunate, because to me, that's the way the world works in the policy world. You don't make a policy decision and or hopefully maybe you don't make a policy decision and live with it to the end of time because somebody made it. How we perceive the world, interact with the world changes with time. So it was interesting to see that angst through time. There's also talk in the literature about how sustainable yield is different than safe yield. They're not. They're the same thing. It really depends. I think those differences come up on when people look in the literature for the definition of safe yield. Because safe yield has been developing over time. And sustainable yield is kind of a term that became popular late 80s, early 90s. That's really the same thing. There's arguments about you should use sustainable yield, not say safe yield, because what is safe, which part of me agrees with that. I think my preference is to talk about sustainable yield.
Right. And I think, when you said that a lot of the concepts were brought from surface water. And so when you look at a reservoir, how much water is coming into the reservoir. And so with the groundwater, then people were fixated on what was the recharge rate, how much water was coming into the aquifer. And if your pumpage was less than the recharge rate, maybe you were okay. But John Bredehoeft called this the water budget myth, and that brings in, where is the water coming from that you're pumping? The Tice, I think, elaborated in the 40s on, so you're pumping water. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from you're changing the water balance. Before you start pumping, the input to the system is equal to the output. So the recharge is balanced by the discharge, or the discharge is balanced by the recharge. Then you start pumping. So that water is coming from either increased recharge or decreased discharge. And so I think those concepts are really important. Sometimes it's difficult for people to remember that. And that relates to what is the impact of your pumpage. So if you decrease the discharge of groundwater, then you're going to impact the surface water that the groundwater was discharging to, or the springs or other things. And so these fundamental concepts are very important. And the connection between groundwater and surface water is critical.
Yes, yeah. And you mentioned I sit at San Marcos Springs, which is a great example of that, where, historically, people use the aquifer, and I would say, the state was fortunate that it's a big aquifer. The San Antonio segment of the Edwards Aquifer is a big aquifer. Very early on, the San Pedro and San Antonio Springs in San Antonio stopped flowing due to production there. And then as agriculture came in and the population of San Antonio continued to grow, and we saw severe droughts, then the question was, what do we want to do with Comal and San Marcos Springs? Well, the locals up here, want to keep the springs flowing. But from the perspective of San Antonio and the irrigators at that time, it's like that water is getting wasted because it's coming out of the aquifer and it's going downriver. And because of quirks in Texas water law, if you can capture that before it hits a state water course, it's private property. And so there were serious engineering plans to build a linear array of wells between San Antonio and San Marcos to intercept all that flow, to keep it from coming out of the springs, to maximize production for human use. Ultimately, it was Endangered Species Act that saved these springs from drying up. They like this recent drought we're in now. If things had gone the way they were going, back in the late 70s and 80s, they'd be dry right now. Maybe they would come back during really wet periods, but they'd be ephemeral. But it was Endangered Species Act that protected the springs. People will be like, well, Endangered Species Act protects spring flow. It really doesn't. It protects the endangered species. And there's assumptions in there. The management of this system is based on a repeat of the drought of record, which for this part of the state is the drought of the 50s. But again, we could have a drought worse than the drought of record. Setting aside climate change, we could have a drought worse than the drought of record. You look at tree ring data, climate change makes it more likely that we're going to see a repeat of the drought or something worse than the drought of record. So there's still a chance that the springs go by despite our best management techniques, which is why the Endangered Species Act provides for these refugias. So if the springs go dry and everything gets extirpated and killed off in those springs, those species can be reintroduced.
Right, right. I mean, the Edwards is a great example because it's dynamic. It responds quickly. You have a drought, it responds quickly. You can see it. You know, some other aquifers that are porous media aquifers, sandstone aquifers, or whatever, it may take, you know, years to see the response and stuff. So it's a really nice example for lay people to understand the linkages between rainfall, droughts, floods, and the response of the aquifer system. I think one of the aspects of your book that I really enjoyed was your description of unconfined and confined aquifers. And I think that is really important and very difficult to parlay to lay people. And in Texas, you know, the Ogallala aquifer is a great example of a large unconfined aquifer, but Crease or Wilcox or Trinity or others, most of the groundwater is confined. Maybe, and when we talk about, you know, are we okay with over-exploiting an aquifer and what are the impacts? We've talked about the connection with surface water, which happens in unconfined aquifers, but then other aspects could be subsidence or seawater intrusion or things like that. So maybe you can describe a little bit about, you know, the concepts of unconfined and confined aquifers and those.
Sure. So you know, an unconfined aquifer is like you know, if you have a glass of water with ice cubes in it and a straw, and if you know, pump your little aquifer, you know, sucking that straw out of your glass of water, you'll see the water level in your glass go down. And so, where's that water coming from? Well, it's coming from the drainage of water in the pores of your aquifer, you know, between the ice cubes. And so that's an unconfined aquifer, and that's how the Ogallala operates. Sand instead of ice cubes, and wells instead of straws. And there's a water table, which is specific to a unconfined aquifer that goes down. And, you know, maybe there's a lot of recharge that happens one day. Maybe it comes up. Mostly in the Ogallala, though, it's going down. Confined aquifer, on the other hand, is, you know, the aquifer is capped to where it's under pressure. And so in that case, you can still drill a well down into that aquifer. And it's kind of like, and I forget what analogy I use in the book because I tried different analogies, but one analogy I like to use is like letting air out of your tire. Like your tire is under pressure. And so if you go over and kind of press on the valve, you can let some air out of your tire. The tire is still full of air. It's just at a lower pressure now. And there's a little bit of compression. Probably you can't measure it depending on how much. If you let a lot of air out of your tire, you'll see it come down. But you get some compression from the overburden of the car, the weight of the car pressing down. Somewhat analogous to a confined aquifer where, you know, you poke a well into it, the water level will rise above the top of the aquifer. If there's enough pressure in the aquifer, it'll rise above the land surface and be an artesian flowing well. And then if you start pumping that well, you'll lower the water level, but the aquifer will still be full of water. So it sounds a little weird, you know, where it's like you pull all this water out of the aquifer, but yet it's still full of water. You know, it sounds like some Yoda would say in Star Wars, where you're like, what the hell does that mean? But it's bleeding off the pressure. And in these confined aquifers, it's that pressure that's extremely valuable because in getting water to go to a well, you know, one of the factors is the head difference or the pressure difference between the background in the aquifer and the pumping level in your well. And so the bigger that difference is, the more water you can push to your well. And in some of our aquifers, it's over 1,000 feet of pressure above the top of the aquifer. And the aquifer may be very, very thin. If it was an unconfined aquifer, you know, maybe you have to put in 10, 20 wells to get the same amount of production from the one well in the confined aquifer.
And so in an unconfined aquifer, then, you're draining the water directly from the pore space. And so the cone of depression that they talk about in a well when you start pumping it is usually fairly local. But in a confined aquifer, then that pressure can expand. And so the water that you're pumping in a confined aquifer is coming from compression of the aquifer and compression of the water. And those compressibilities are almost zero, but they're still enough to release water.
No, and that's a great point. The Ogallala is a fabulous groundwater resource, and it's, I think, a big part of what makes it so fabulous is it is unconfined, which allows all those thousands of farmers to do their thing. But like the Carrizo-Wilcox, which is mostly confined, the cone of depression around Bryan College Station is like 100 feet wide. I'm sorry, 100 miles wide. So it stretches across 3 counties. Sometimes there's talk in the legislature about assigning, like if you pump a well and you pull water from someone else's property, you owe them a check because you've taken their water. And, there's a certain logic to that, I guess. But then I'm like, what the hell does Bryan College Station do when there's probably tens of thousands of property owners that have been affected by their pumping? And, how do you calculate that? That could be an administrative nightmare in a confined aquifer.
And I love the aspects of your book when you're talking about the historical development. When they drilled those first wells into the confined aquifer, they had artesian flowing wells. I mean, and they were just gobsmacked. This is a limitless supply. And can go on forever. And of course, they left those artesian wells flowing and everything. And I like that you presented your book in a reading forward mode, because oftentimes we just think after the fact, well, we knew everything, but it's much more difficult to present the story, like trying to put yourself in the position that they were in and what they knew and what they didn't know. And so those artesian wells early on, and same in California, they had these flowing artesian wells, thought a limitless supply, and there's no end to this.
Well, I don't know about you, but I mean, I'll drive 100 miles to go see a flowing artesian well and have.
Right.
But yeah, back in the day, the artesian well drilling boom in Western society started with the Grinnell well in Paris. It captured the imagination of the world. It was like a well that took something like 7-8 years to they did a cable tool chipping rather than drilling, but to drill. And it came in flowing an amazing amount of water, and it was world famous. And so that prompted folks to start wildcatting water wells. And so in Fort Worth in Texas, the first big one was in Fort Worth that then kicked off a bunch of wildcatting of wells across the state. And early on, the R.T. Hill, who's like the godfather of geology in Texas, with the best information he had at the time, said some unfortunate things, which was one of them was he did practically limitless supply. He made some estimates of the recharge rates, which were ridiculously high. I'm remembering 50% of rainfall. And in reality, it's much less than that, maybe 4%. And then what actually goes down dip to the confined zones, 1% of rainfall. And so people just drill these wells in and just let them flow down the streets. And it was like having a Model S Tesla in your front yard. If you had a flowing well, it'd make the neighbors jealous. So they drilled hundreds. Dallas was jealous, and they drilled their first one at the Big Red, the old courthouse. That well is still there. You can go look at it. And they're still using it, believe it or not, in the Trinity. And it came in and just gushed really, really good. And people just came from miles around. There's a guy quoted in the Dallas Morning News. He's like, I'd soon come see this than a hanging. This is a lot of fun. But, and then the USGS scientists started realizing, well, they saw the pressures declining. And they were just like, this isn't good. Realized that the estimates that they had made about recharge were not correct, and started encouraging people, hey, you need to shut these wells off. Don't open them when you use the water, shut them down when you're not, to preserve the pressure. But people believe what they want to believe. There's a lot of kind of classic human psychology in this, and in respect to how we relate to the natural environment, natural resources. And within 20 years, all those wells had stopped flowing.
Right. Yeah. And I think, in the book you talk about, most people are familiar with the Ogallala aquifer and the fate of the water there. And many people are familiar with the Edwards aquifer. But I don't think people are as familiar with the Trinity aquifer in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. And you describe that very nicely in the book, where you see up to 1,000 feet of drawdown in the Trinity aquifer for municipal purposes, not just irrigation. And that happened in the early 1900s, right?
Right. Yeah, I was, I kind of point to, so I worked on the superconducting supercollider site when I worked for the Bureau, and was working on putting together a numerical groundwater flow model because the Department of Energy was considering pumping from the Trinity to cool the particle accelerator for the supercollider. And one of the things when you develop a model is you try to get pre-development water levels. So you kind of see how the system was before there was any pumping, calibrate to that, and then move forward. And so I was surprised, like digging back in time, that, found this 1901 RT Hill report with all these kind of shut-in pressures for these wells. And was just amazed at that was out there, and nobody had really dug that far back, which that gave me the history bug. But people put in all those wells. You saw a Kona depression or water level declines from 1885 to like 1915, and then things leveled off until downhole pump technology became affordable, and then you saw levels drop again, and pretty much they dropped those levels down to the top of the aquifer, more than 1,000 feet below land surface. And then what we've seen there is your productivity of the well, because you don't have high enough background pressures to push the water to your well, went way down, and so I think less than 1% of water for Dallas-Fort Worth is from groundwater. It was a lot higher in the day. It's still an important source of supply. I often describe groundwater in Texas as the gateway drug to development. So people will tap groundwater, and then people will overpump, and then have problems with their wells, and then transfer to more centralized surface water supplies.
And the nice thing that you describe about that example, it's mostly confined. And right, so the narrow unconfined portion then, where there's surface water and groundwater interacting in the unconfined portion, is not really impacted that much by all the pumpage and the decline in the confined aquifer, because only less than 1% of it is coming from that outcrop zone.
Yeah, that was the other fascinating thing back in my Bureau days, was looking at those huge water level declines, and they hinged off the outcrop. The water levels just hinged off the outcrop. And then that prompted me to go look, had there been base flow declines? And no, there hadn't been. And so it's a permeability limited system is what it boils down to. So there's a lot of recharge coming in and then coming out in the recharge zone, but only a very small amount of it goes down dip. And so even though with that 1,000-foot water level decline, we've increased the hydraulic gradient, or the volume of flow going deep into the aquifer 3 to 4 times, there's not been a measurable impact up in the outcrop. That's starting to change, not because of the pumping down dip, but because development has now moved over the outcrop. And so now you've got all these household wells out there, and they're starting to see some water level issues, similar to what we see in our backyard here in the hill country.
And it's nice, when you say, they deplete, it's not nice that they depleted the Trinity aquifer, but then they shifted to surface water, and they have all these reservoirs there now, and many of the reservoirs at different times are full, and so they could put water back into the aquifer using managed aquifer recharge or aquifer storage and recovery. And I think maybe we've seen similar thing in Houston. They pumped a lot of groundwater early on, then they had subsidence. but we didn't see subsidence in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. Maybe we weren't monitoring it as much, but you had a lot of subsidence in Houston, and then that caused them to shift from groundwater to surface water.
Right. Yeah, I did the calculations back in the day up in Dallas-Fort Worth, and the rocks are pretty competent. The compressibility is low, that you wouldn't have expected to see, even with 1,000 feet of water level decline, you wouldn't have expected to see land subsidence. Houston, of course, is a different story. Those are relatively new sediments. There's been a great deal of groundwater pumped out down there, and historically, Houston was 100% reliant on groundwater. And some lawsuits popped up of one landowner accusing another landowner of pumping groundwater and sinking their property into the Gulf of Mexico. San Jacinto Monument, which is, of course, a holy spot for Texans. That's where Sam Houston rushed Santa Ana and defeated the Mexican army, and Texas earned its independence, was literally sinking into the Gulf of Mexico. One of the main roads actually went completely underwater. And so there was a lawsuit and then legislation that created kind of a special district, a land subsidence control district down there to basically get people off of groundwater onto surface water to minimize land subsidence. And so they manage, kind of similar to what I described groundwater, the gateway drug. They'll let people on the fringes use groundwater, and then they reach a certain point where they then, force them over to use surface water to control land subsidence down there. That's particularly an issue in Houston because it's so close to the sea level and the massive floods. And we saw some interesting things when Harvey came through. For example, I was still with the state and watching that flood pretty closely. And we're trying to figure out like when different flood control reservoirs would spill, but nobody had gone out and sighted them in a while. And so they'd actually sunk. And so it was hard to figure out what was going on because of the land subsidence.
But I mean, oftentimes people think one size fits all. And if you think about California, they've had a lot of subsidence and stuff. And then they think anywhere you have a lot of groundwater depletion, then you're going to have subsidence. But I think, as you say, the Trinity aquifer is indurated enough and so not that compressible. Maybe the Creasy-Wilcox, also Winter Garden area, there's been a lot of depletion, but I don't think we've seen a lot of subsidence. But I'm not sure that we monitored it. But
I would say stay tuned because there was a paper that came out that was using interferometer satellite data, and it was focused on the Houston area, but it happened to get part of the Creasy-Wilcox and the Bryan College Station, and it showed land subsidence up there.
Right.
Appreciable.
Right, but not to the extent that we've seen in Houston, where you say the sediments. Right. So I guess, we've talked about a lot of the challenges and the initial overexploitation and then the adaptation, maybe where you can move from groundwater to surface water. But in the Ogallala, dried up a lot of the springs along the edges of the Ogallala, and surface water declines. But there you don't have much surface water that you can use, so you're kind of stuck. And the recharge rates are extremely low in the Ogallala. And it always cracks me up when people say, well, under irrigated areas, you have higher recharge, but they're pulling the water from the aquifer. And so, it's going through the soil a bit faster, but it's ultimately coming from the groundwater. And so it's not increasing the groundwater storage, because what you're pulling out is much greater than what's going back in.
Right. And it's interesting too, like the numbers I see for total recharge for the Ogallala in Texas, they're bigger than the average recharge to the Edwards aquifer, but we're pumping it at 6 times the rate that's coming back in. So that's how I operated my checking account in college, and it didn't have a happy ending. So.
Yeah, I know when we did work way back in Amarillo area, we found that they were pumping maybe over 10 times what was recharging and stuff. So you can't do that for very long anyway. But so to get back then to potential solutions, and you've been discussing some already, shifting from groundwater to surface water where they could. But maybe let's look at Austin as an example. I think maybe you participated in the future planning for Austin, the water forward. And I normally think of solutions, and think of a bank account, input minus output is change in your balance, So to manage it, then you could increase how much you're depositing or reduce your withdrawals and hopefully stabilize your bank balance. So can you describe some of the aspects that they're considering in Austin Water Forward, this integrated water resources planning effort?
Sure. So Austin, in response for Austin, the drought was 2009 to 2015. That became a new drought of record for the Colorado River there, as well as the Highland Lakes. And it was disturbing. I know you live in Austin. I lived in Austin. It was disturbing to see how quickly those reservoirs went down. Part of that is agreements at the Lower Colorado River Authority and how they manage. And for the most part, they're looking backwards at the drought of record. Austin got concerned to where climate change is not considered in regional and state water planning, so they wanted to look at climate change. And because they're looking at climate change, they also wanted to look out 100 years rather than the 50 years that state and regional water planning is under. I joined halfway through the first round and with them now through the second round, but I'm part of a citizens advisory panel to Austin Water in developing this plan and identifying strategies. One takeaway with the current plan, we're currently revising it, but the current plan projects the population of Austin proper, not Greater Austin, Austin proper, from 1 million today to 4 million people in 100 years, which was a shock. It's I'm just like, is that New York City? But it's more density like Los Angeles. I'm like, okay, maybe. And then the other shock was that looking at climate change, in 100 years, the Colorado River and the Highland Lakes is probably going to produce half of what it produces today. So in other words, it's going to become a lot less reliable. You can argue about the assumptions. I think a lot about those assumptions. It is, I hesitate to call it a worst case scenario because it can always be worse. But things kind of lean towards the bad direction in terms of the assumptions of looking at climate change. And it's up for debate and how realistic those are. But I'm becoming more convinced that that's a good thing to do since there's a great deal of uncertainty. So in terms of like how Austin's going to deal with that, the biggest is aquifer storage and recovery. They're going to take excess treated Colorado River water during the good years and inject it into a local aquifer. They haven't chosen, they're in the process of doing studies now. They haven't chosen one, but my guess is going to be Carrizo Wilcox. It has a really good track record with San Antonio, who does that with the taking excess Edwards water, storing it in the Carrizo. They've had close to 200,000 acre feet of water stored underground, which would be equivalent to 4 years of Austin's annual use of water. So great deal of storage potential there. After that, it's a lot of kind of using water more efficiently. So kind of like you talked about with your budget, it's like you kind of decrease your use of the resource while also looking for other supplies. And so there's some interesting things that Austin is looking to do is continue to promote rainwater harvesting and condensate harvesting, amplify their water reuse program. Austin has a new main library down on the lake that uses rainwater harvesting and condensate harvesting to meet all indoor in outdoor non-potable uses. And by doing that, they've been able to lower their use of the Colorado River by 90%. Austin also recently opened up a new permitting center in north central Austin that collects condensate from air conditionings, rainwater, but then also has an on-site black water, basically wastewater treatment plant. And the output from that plant goes back in the flush toilets and urinals again. And they've been able to lower their use of their source supply by 95%. I went to that opening. I encourage you to go see it. It's pretty much, it's like kind of out in the open. There's interpretive signage. It's the cutest damn wastewater treatment plant you have ever seen. I've never cried at a wastewater treatment plant opening, but I did at this one. It's just so adorable.
Right. So you did a report many years ago with Sam Hermite. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Hermit. Yeah. And about per capita water use in the urban areas in Texas. And so that report was titled "The Grass is Always Greener." And it made me think of Irma Bombeck's book, "The Grass is Always Greener Under the Septic Tank." But so at that point time, and I'm not sure the numbers were about 200 and almost 270 gallons per capita per day, or per household. I don't know, was it per capita or per?
It's probably that sounds like a total GPCD.
So per capita. Gallons per capita per day.
So it would be probably the total.
Yeah, indoor
use
and
of
outdoor.
Austin.
Yes.
Well, this is probably for Austin total, and then divided by the population.
Right. And 2019, City of Austin was saying it's down to 120 gallons per capita per day. So I think the incentives for indoor fixtures and maybe people converting to, different lawn systems and all of these things are reducing that demand, and have to reduce it to a lot if you're considering the population growth. So many factors to consider. And when you mentioned with climate change, reducing the reservoirs volume in the Highland Lakes, I guess maybe a lot of that would be increased evaporation related to the projected temperature increases also.
Yeah, that's part of it. And then also just decreased runoff.
Right. So a lot of challenges, but we're always trying to adapt then to these and to manage. And you mentioned wastewater reuse, and I guess Big Springs is one of the few areas where there's direct potable reuse globally, I think, or in the US. In the US, maybe.
Yeah, it's the first place in the US to do direct potable reuse. And if your listeners aren't familiar, that's treating wastewater without an environmental buffer that goes back into the drinking water system. Indirect would be you put it in the river, flow it down the river, pull it out, and treat it, which happens a lot. Direct is like it's not touching a lake, it's not touching a river, it's not touching an aquifer. Is direct potable reuse. But that's the first plant in the United States and the second in the world, the first being in Namibia, Africa, that started in like the mid 80s. El Paso is currently building a big direct potable reuse plant that they call it direct to distribution. So the Big Springs project, they treat the wastewater and then it goes into a raw water pipeline that gets mixed with raw water from the reservoir and then goes to a conventional surface water treatment plant. So it's direct potable reuse, but it gets mixed with raw water and goes through additional treatment. El Paso is going to do direct to distribution, so they're not going to mix it with raw water. It's going to get treated and then stuck directly into the distribution to their community. So that's an exciting project. And there's a couple dozen projects in the water plan, including several in Central Texas, to employ direct potable reuse.
And with advances in treatment technology, I think that makes that feasible, tertiary treated wastewater and other things. So I think those advantages have helped. So, Robert, you're a glutton for punishment, and you weren't satisfied with what you had to endure to produce your first book. Now you're looking at another book, and maybe you can describe that a little bit for the listeners.
Sure. So, I didn't learn my lesson the first time, so I thought, I'll write another book. This one is it's called Beyond a Reasonable Drought, and it's focused on climate change impacts on water resources. So similar to this groundwater sustainability book, I'm writing it in hopefully an accessible way and following the water cycle all the way around to talk about how a warming planet affects every part of the water cycle, and then what impacts it may have on our water resources. Again, across the entire planet. But I'm Texan. I can't help but bring my Texan experience to the table. So there'll certainly be a lot of Texas stories in there to boot.
Well, I mean, Texas is a great field lab for many of these examples.
It is. Yeah, it is. It has everything.
So you mentioned oftentimes that people don't get your puns, but I guess beyond a reasonable doubt or beyond a seasonal drought. Just to be explicit, we can be very subtle these days.
I have been warned by the editors that that title may not stay, but I'm going to fight for it.
Right. So considering all the work you've been doing and your involvement with the state and now at Texas State University and stuff, how do you see the future of water resources in Texas? Are you optimistic, or do you?
On balance, I'm optimistic. I'm quoted in Seamus McGraw's book about water in Texas as saying that the Gulf of Mexico helps me sleep at night, and it does. We're fortunate that we have easy access to desalinated seawater. I feel like that is going to be a big answer for us going forward. We'll just see when that happens. Corpus Christi has several projects that hopefully one of those will get realized. There's legitimate concerns about seawater desalination. There's the power; it's very power intensive. But I also feel confident that renewables and energy can be used that doesn't contribute to global warming can be found. And then the disposal of the brine concentrate. And the projects that have been proposed and are under consideration now are pretty much discharging into the kind of the bays and estuaries. And so that's caused a great deal of concern. But I feel like that can be engineered in a way to minimize impacts. And Texas does have an incentive for folks to go offshore. However, that's expensive. And then people will also say, well, seawater desalination is too expensive. But when you start bringing in these more esoteric reuse approaches, even some of the more advanced water conservation techniques, seawater desalination is either competitive or far less expensive. So I feel like that's going to get there. What causes me concern is that the state does not consider climate change in its water planning, and that's troubling because I think it does put a number of Texans, industry, the environment at risk for water supplies. But I also feel confident at some point maybe we're a little slow in the uptake, but at some point we'll get there. Unfortunately, I think in Texas it's gonna be something scary that's gonna have to happen before things get considered. One of the things I'm working on at the Meadow Center is to provide that information to planners. So at least they have it when they're evaluating their plans. So if they want to, they can then build that in. There is a increasing drumbeat of concern about climate change and demand for information on climate change in the regional water plans. So for political reasons, the state agencies can't address it, but as academics, we can. It also allows me to leverage kind of my practical experience with working for the state to kind of provide information that the planners can use.
Well, I think that's a really good summary, because we generally adapt. I mean, you can see, we had the drought in 2011, extreme drought, and a couple of years afterwards, and you could see people, maybe changing their lawns and doing different things. It's kind of like quitting smoking. It takes a long time for things to penetrate and for people to change behavior. And I was just talking to a colleague from Israel yesterday, and they now get 80% of their potable water from seawater desal. And he explained to me that the discharge concentrate, they mix it with seawater. So when they discharge it, it's only slightly elevated. And they have these mile-long pipelines where they diffuse it out into the Mediterranean. So there are lots of things that people are doing. And you're right, it's good that we're next to the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, I look at Australia, they built emergency seawater desal plants in that nasty drought from 20 years ago. And they've engineered things in a way that minimizes impact to the environment. I also think there's a benefit seawater desal to the environment, because even tree hugging Austin, if there's a choice between putting water in the river for environmental flows versus keeping water in the system for people, what's Austin going to do? I mean, it's going to be for the people. And so if there's a true drought-proof supply of water, in my mind, that actually increases the likelihood that there'll be water in our rivers for the environment.
Right. And the wastewater reuse, that's also kind of drought-proof and increases with population growth. So
yeah, I would argue with you on that, though. It's only as good as the source supply. Right. So if your source supply is like, for example, Austin's wastewater, you got to have water to have wastewater. And so if the river dries up, there ain't no wastewater.
Right. Yeah. Well, our guest today is Robert Mace, and he's the executive director at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment. And I would encourage you to read his book, Groundwater Sustainability, Conception, Development and Application. It's available on Amazon. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you for having me, Bridget.